Hi, I'm Maximilian Hess. I'm a political risk consultant and the author of Economic War, Ukraine and the Global Conflict Between Russia and the West. And welcome back. Thank you for joining us again this week.
I'm Harish Natarajan, and today we're going to talk a bit more about tariffs and where Trump is going given the last week.
Over the last week, I think we've really learned quite a lot about Trump's tariff strategy and what he's overall trying to achieve with this economic and trade conflict that he launched on Liberation Day, the 2nd of April of this year. We've seen this because we've seen not one, but two deals, and I use air quotes intentionally because they are not legally binding documents at this point. And one of them, the more important with China, is also only a 90-day pause. That came on the 12th of May as the result of negotiations between a U.S. and a Chinese delegation in Switzerland. But then we also, before that, saw the first actual deal to extend things with the United Kingdom on the 8th of May. And in that UK deal, we saw essentially the British government climb down. They agreed to the 10% blanket tariff that Trump had imposed on everybody on that 2nd of April announcement. In exchange, they got some carve-outs for the UK automotive industry, UK steel and aluminium, which, to be frank, are not important industries today. Just last month, the British government had to bail out its last major steel producer. So essentially what Donald Trump has gotten is a rhetoric win and a very strong mercantilist success. Essentially the zero-sum view that these trade agreements can be used to boost terms for the United States and weaken them for other partners is something that the Starmer government has agreed to. Now the Starmer government is in a fairly weak position domestically and is really seeking to avoid additional escalation from Trump while retaining that so-called special relationship. So in some ways it didn't have that much political room otherwise. In China, however, we've seen a significant climb down from the tariff of 145% total that the Trump administration had imposed, which Trump himself admitted in recent days was essentially a blockade on trade, with the U.S. tariff coming down to 30% for these 90 days, while China will only put in an additional 10% tariff on U.S. goods. Further negotiations are expected. Trump has stated he is willing to reimpose tariffs, even though he hinted he perhaps wouldn't go back as high as 145%. But this is really negative for the U.S. economy if this is the kind of position that we end up in. Because the U.S. average tariff rate was just about 2.5% at the beginning of the year. China is the U.S.'s largest trade partner. We can see very clearly from the UK deal that there's an aim for a 10% minimum tariff on everybody, and as of now, at least a 30% tariff on China for the foreseeable future. We've already had economic growth data from Q1 showing that GDP contracted. That was before this trade war was launched. It's all but certain that GDP will contract further in Q2. That will get us into a technical recession. And then it remains to be seen, of course, what happens in Q3 and Q4. But right now, markets are positive. The S&P 500, the U.S. benchmark index, is back up on the year from January 1st. But our prediction is that there's quite a bit more downward room to come, as I expect that that recession will last not only coming at the end of Q2, but will certainly last through Q3 and most likely Q4 as well.
I think there are two things I find quite interesting about this. And in the most general way possible, you could think of this about deals with allies or traditional allies and deals with your adversaries. And I think what we saw with the UK is where the US's landing zone is for its deals with countries that they have good relations with or traditionally had good relations with, which is exactly that. A 10% tariff generally across the board with some opt-outs and carve-outs. So what I think we saw on Liberation Day was something which may be more maximalist, that Trump wanted to do a great deal more, achieve a lot more through tariffs, and over the month it was fairly clear that wasn't going to occur. And there is a change in terms of here is what they are looking for from their allies. A tariff on them or a reduction in the tariffs they currently put in place, and 10% in most areas seems probably where that landing zone is. The China adversary claim I find to be more interesting here, because I'm not sure what the landing zone there is. And I don't think it is this temporary suspension. I think as Max notes, there was a huge economic reaction to all of the tariffs, but even just the China ones when Trump backed down from his initial Liberation Day tariffs. And this, I think, is going to be something which is going to be more clear in the months to come as we see those negotiations over China. What exactly does the United States want? What is China willing to give? And what does that actually mean? I suspect the eventual number could be slightly below 30%, but probably above 10%, um, with some Chinese promises of purchasing more US products as a result. But I think it is unclear. I'm not sure even the administration knows exactly where it wants to go with these Chinese tariffs, other than somehow reduce, if not eliminate, the trade deficit.
In the last few days, it's been reported that US President Donald Trump plans on accepting a private plane from the Qatari government valued at more than $400 million, which has been outfitted to the highest security and communication standards for use by the Qatari royal family. Trump has already seen the plane. It was used by a Qatari delegation to fly to Mar-a-Lago, Trump's so-called Winter White House in Florida, earlier this year. And Donald Trump is today, as we record this, in Qatar and may accept it very soon. This has provoked a backlash not only from Democrats, but also from some of Trump's own supporters, although primarily they have couched that in language over Qatar's geopolitical position rather than on pure corruption. In my view, this is perhaps the most indelible stain of personal dealing that the Trump administration has seen thus far. And that's certainly something we saw a lot of under the first Trump administration, that we've seen with Donald Trump's children trading off of his name to accept other investments from Middle Eastern royals or to sell them cryptocurrencies. But this is particularly egregious because it involves a national security matter where this plane is being directly handed over to the President of the United States. The U.S. Constitution includes an emoluments clause in it, in which it explicitly states that U.S. officials, and certainly the U.S. President, are not to accept gifts from foreign leaders and monarchs. And this flies in the face of that entirely. And yes, it has provoked something of a backlash, but remember, the United States is the country that only 50 years ago stopped then President Jimmy Carter from continuing to own a peanut farm that sold agricultural produce to the U.S. government over corruption concerns. Today, the U.S. is no longer in a position to criticize any other countries on that matter and is giving up a crucial soft power tool as a result.
I think it's worth disaggregating what's happening here. So first, about US corruption and whether it's losing a soft power tool. I think the reality is there are very few people anywhere in the world who would believe that Congress, the presidency, is free from any kind of corruption or external influence. All you have to look at the millions made by almost everyone in Congress, well above anything that legitimate wealth should allow them to get, to realize corruption is partially endemic within the US political system. But looking primarily at the play, I don't think it's great that you accept a large gift from a foreign state, but I also think that there is an overstatement of what the actual consequences or risks here are. Donald Trump suggests he'll take the plane. What's the first thing he gets from Qatar? An agreement or a deal that they're going to buy large numbers of Boeings. What does Qatar think they're going to get out of this? And if there's anything from it, maybe they think that Trump will be slightly more positively disposed towards them. Important given his very strong relations with the Saudis. Maybe they think around the margin he'll be a little bit kinder to them as a result. But it's really difficult to see where the real risk of corruption is and what we think the Trump administration would do as a result of this gift that it otherwise won't. And I suspect that probably what actually happened was a few Qatari royals realized how much Trump liked the plane, thought it's nice to have him in your favor without any specifications of what they wanted from it. So it's not great, but I think it is overblown when people think of this as a huge corruption issue for the United States.
The opening scene of The Godfather literally includes the line that I may not have an ask of you today, but one day in the future, I may come to you for a favor. And that's exactly what I think the Qataris are thinking here. Now, remember, there may not be, as you say, some immediate nefarious act. And yes, I certainly agree with you that corruption overall within the U.S. political system on both sides of the aisle has been a problem. But this isn't the straw that breaks the camel's back. This is literally the jumbo plane that should break the camel's back. And particularly on not just those geopolitical issues that you spoke about with regards to Qatar's relations with Saudi Arabia, its risks of being targeted by the U.S. for its support for independent media or semi-independent media in the Middle East, or occasionally allowing groups such as the Taliban and Hamas to base their foreign offices there as a relatively safe diplomatic space. But remember, Qatar and the United States are the world's number 2 and number 1 exporters of liquefied natural gas. LNG, as it's known, is the key commodity of the energy trade of the future. Whether or not we've hit peak oil is another subject that we can debate, but whether it be Angola, whether it be the United States, whether it be Qatar, even Saudi Arabia, you see all these major hydrocarbon producers positioning themselves for the LNG world of the future. Donald Trump himself has said and made one of his most clear statements that I think there's very few people who would push back on, that he wants to promote U.S. LNG sales. In a lot of markets, the U.S. competes with Qatar, and perhaps not in China, but certainly in Europe. If you are a U.S. LNG business now, and you're looking and have been hoping for the kind of government support that Trump had at least indicated the administration would put behind that sector, how do you view this now, and how do you plan for the long-term future when, let's say, there is a market crisis, LNG prices come way down, and then Qatar is able to call on Donald Trump and say, we need you to ensure that we remain in a strong position so that we can give you planes in the future or service your planes. And remember, the most egregious part about this isn't just that it's being transferred or supposedly set to be transferred to use by Trump while he's president, but it will thereafter be transferred, allegedly, according to the reports that we've seen, to Donald Trump's personal foundation set up to manage his presidential legacy, which is not a government-run institution, and would essentially ensure that this plane is available for his future use.
So what we can agree on is there's probably no quid pro quo, no evidence of that at all. It isn't a gift for something specific, but maybe an attempt to get something in the future. The thing is, the United States doesn't need to respond to that necessarily. The Trump administration or Donald Trump himself doesn't need to do something which a Qatari is asking him to do, even when it doesn't serve his interest or the interest of the United States. And when you look at that LNG example, I think that kind of highlights the kinds of areas where Qatar probably won't have much influence. This is a priority for the United States. It's a thing which Donald Trump has been talking about getting the Europeans to buy more. It would seem unlikely to me that for a $400 million gift, still not a small amount, but not necessarily the largest amount or most important thing to him, that you're going to see large changes in US policy in priority areas. So I look at this much more as someone trying to build a more friendly relationship with the President of the United States. Maybe there'll be some positives from it, but it's really difficult to see how large they could be or why they would harm the national interests of the United States.
A Brazilian billionaire family donated $5 million to Donald Trump's inaugural committee. 2 months later, the SEC dropped its charges against them. Another convicted criminal fraudster, the founder of the company Milton in the United States, also donated $2 million to Trump's inaugural committees, or just under, and was subsequently pardoned by Donald Trump. If Donald Trump and his administration's policy decisions are purchasable for the single-digit millions, certainly I think that Qatar can and has reason to expect that for such a large gift, it will be able to make a significant ask in the future.
So there's a recursivity problem about that kind of way of looking at it, which is, did Donald Trump pardon them because they gave him a gift, or is this largely with his agenda, and as a result, other people want to be moved up the agenda, something which they want to be higher up on a pardon list, or being considered, or believe that they are more likely to gain as Trump as president? But I think that's one part of it. But none of that would be core to US interest. It is whether someone is pardoned or not, whether there's investigation or not. That is quite different to the kinds of changes or big changes that people believe that the Qataris will potentially ask for.
You know, I think one of the most important aspects to this issue is what precedent does it set for the future? Even if Qatar doesn't come for an ask now, it will enable future governments and future third parties to also make large donations to U.S. administrations. We've seen a lot of criticism from the Trump administration and his own supporters about, for example, the role that then Vice President, eventual President Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, took on the board of a Ukrainian company during the Obama administration. And I would certainly agree that the optics thereof were terrible. Now, one can similarly make the point that the Democrats' failure to crack down on that directly led to the slippery slope that has now enabled Trump to at least get away with, in terms of public perception, the accepting of this $400 million plane. But it's simply the gargantuan scale of it that is really, quite large. This is and the personal use of it that I think really sets a very dangerous precedent. What are we to say in Trump's post-presidency, in the future when he's flying around the world on a Qatari-issued plane and potentially shilling for them, and still has the loyalty of a large number of his supporters? That is essentially the best lobbying that you can buy for the Qataris for the future. And there has been a bipartisan effort from not the majority of either party, but from outspoken members of both the left-wing faction of the Democratic Party and some of the more right-wing factions of the Republican Party to ban some of these corrupt practices. We just saw a group of Congress people introduce legislation known as the Pelosi Act, Preventing Elected Legislators from Owning Securities and Investments Act, named after former Democratic Speaker Nancy Pelosi, whose family have been famously successful trading the markets since she became an elected official many decades ago. So, those efforts are good, but in my view, but the Trump administration's actions here not only will show that there's a willingness to kill them and a Trump veto over them, which will stop them from getting passed in the first place, but in the future will always be used as the benchmark to allow other kinds of quid pro quo.
I would just finally add that to the degree this is a huge gift, I actually think that is what makes it less likely to be corrupt. The number of people will be paying attention to this, given just how high profile it is, larger than the Hunter Biden scandals, which was still covered constantly about the ways they may have contributed to corruption, is actually more of a safeguard than actually a harm when it comes to deals of this kind of size. But with that, we are going to be ending for today. If there are any topics you want us to discuss, any questions you have, please feel free to email us or contact us.
You can reach us either by leaving a comment below or emailing intel@akegroup.com.